table, and if anyone would like to see it, so that we can have any discussion. The resolution is not regarding our workshop tonight, it's regarding hiring of legal counsel for a zoning board issue that we have. And the lines, Karen, will fill in the numbers as we go along. We now come to our portion. Oh, I'm sorry. Karen, you want to do a roll call?
Mr. Carnicella.
Here.
Mrs. Danchak Martin. Here. Mr. Ferrara.
Here.
Mr. Klein.
Here.
Mr. Kaczynski.
Here.
Mr. Riley. Ms. Russo. Here. Mr. Scalera.
Here.
Mr. Sposato.
Here, after we do this. Okay, we now come to the portion of our meeting where we allow members of the public to address the board. This section will allow questions and comments on only a resolution item on tonight's agenda. Our board regulation 601 allot 20 minutes for each communication. Each person shall be limited to 3 minutes, and we ask you to try to stay within the requirement. Speakers may speak more than once, only if others wishing to speak on that topic have been heard. All statements will be directed to me as chairperson. No one may address board members individually. Please be reminded that if your statement is too lengthy, abusive, obscene, irrelevant, redundant, your participation may be terminated. Please remember always to state your name, address, and every time you address the board, sign in with Karen, Mrs. Yeamans, before you take the microphone. The first person wishing to be heard, please step up.
Are we conferencing you and Mr. Rowley?
We'll do that when we do the retreat, start the retreat. I don't think this is necessary. Karen, do you read it so that they know what the...
Resolution for approval of services. Be it resolved that the Board of Education approves extending the services of Thomas DiBiase as special counsel for the zoning board hearing regarding the bus lane at a rate not to exceed $1,000, and the services of a planner at a rate not to exceed $1,000.
Second.
We need first.
Actually, can Charlie, you move the resolution?
Freddie moved it, I seconded.
Okay, Karen, you want to call the roll call?
Mr. Carnicella.
Yes.
Mrs. Danchak Martin. Yes. Mr. Ferrara.
Yes.
Mr. Klein.
Yes.
Mr. Kaczynski.
Yes.
Ms. Russo. Yes. Mr. Scalera.
Yes.
Mr. Sposato.
Yes. Okay. We are now going to start our board retreat. I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Lazar to explain procedures and history.
Before I begin, just for the audience, the board wanted me to comment on the format of the meeting. It's not a normal, general, open, public meeting, as you see from the agenda. Basically, these retreats are so the board can get together as a group of 9 and talk about important issues. We have 2 to 3 of them a year. There is no general public comment. However, the board wanted to make sure that we got out that we have received a great number of emails going back to last week and certainly before that on the topic. They have all been read. In the aftermath of this meeting, there'll be a summary of the discussion points, which will be put into writing, sent to the PTO Vienna Club, but also directed to anyone who emailed at least me, so that there'll be a direct response and the same copy of that information. The other piece, obviously, is that while you're listening to this discussion, and I apologize for the format, it's not interactive, certainly at the next board meeting, based on what we send out. Other questions, you don't have to wait for the next board meeting. We can certainly continue to communicate either with the administration, myself, with members of the board, and then certainly, obviously, the next open meeting is in April. All right? As requested by the board in preparation for this conversation, we wanted a summary of the previous work that's gone on, exactly where we are in the 14-15 school year. I arrived in 2011-2012 to questions from specific principals at the elementary level that they had space concerns. The board, in its wisdom, created an ad hoc committee after restructuring called the Long Range Facilities Planning Committee, which Ms. Danchek-Martin took the lead on as the chair. That committee immediately asked for information, which led to the hiring of an architect, a new architect, going through the appropriate process, as well as a professional education demographer. All this happened at the end of the 2011-12 school year into the 12-13 school year. The architect and demographer did an expansive summary or investigation of our existing buildings, building by building, K-8. They also looked at the demographer, then followed a specific format. This presentation was made public on the existing state of the district, historically, where we are, and what predictions they were making for space. Based on those recommendations, which at the time the demographer was making, based on his calculations, a statement that the population of the district with no new building was scheduled to increase slightly over the next 4 or 5 years, projecting that new construction would be adding students as well. We've made specific recommendations about how the board could best handle that. Based on the recommendations of that, combined with the architect, who again studied each building individually, what spaces we were using, what spaces we were allowed to use, and what space might be readily available to us. The conclusion of the demographer was that there were already well-established zones throughout Nutley, 35 elementary schools, and that to mess with those zones, number one, would impact culture, number two, could divide family, in the sense that siblings may be in 2 different schools, but most importantly, what he was saying is, based on his findings, there are no places to put extra students. If School 1, Lincoln School, had a balloon of students you could not house, there were no places in other buildings that you could shift it to without causing the same issue with space as the other buildings. Based on these and working with the architect, we came up with a plan taking into account, as I said, existing populations, what was temporarily known as far as new building, as well as at the time, what any other new building that was on the horizon. And a plan was presented to the board, which involved modifying both the middle school and preparing it for the receipt of all of our 6th grade students throughout the district, as well as one of our elementary schools to service an expansion in their population, as well as our growing special needs population, which has been one of the causes that has taken space away from our buildings. One of the key findings from the architect was that it needs to be made clear that while our building space hasn't changed and our population numbers may have been less currently than they have been decades in the past, how we are legally allowed to use our space has changed dramatically. Based on special needs and best practices across the district, across the state, we are not able to house and serve as many students in any of our 5 elementary buildings as we have in the past, because of requirements of program that now limit space that could hold, as far as capacity, 25, 27, 30 students. We can now fit no more than 10 or 11. And so in a sense, we've lost in sometimes half of our spaces. Based on that and that plan, the LRFPC had meetings with each of the commissioners to discuss the plans, financial impact, and the rest. And at that point in time, what had become known to us in the town was that the single largest payer of taxes, Roche, would be leaving. That unknown was factored into the recommended plan of the architect, using estimates from the demographer to ensure that any physical alteration to this building that we made would in fact be able to handle, at worst, the most possible students that could come from that physical geographic area. So that the board was in fact planning responsibly, not just for existing problems and predicted future problems, but the unpredicted as well. That would not be to say that we would not need to touch other buildings, depending on what happened with that property, but that we would only have to touch this building once in order to house 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. While that, yes?
Mr. Lesser, when did we start that conversation? Dates?
I'd have to go back to the agenda, but 12-13 school.
12-13, and we met with the commissioners.
The end of the 12-13 school year.
And discussed what we're talking about here tonight.
Exactly. Presented them with our academics. We presented them with program that had been changed at that point, including all of our strategic planning work. We presented them with historic numbers, current numbers at the time, and the full demographer's report, so that they understood what the projections were. One of the unknowns in the demographer's report was that he was predicting certain things, but also had a caveat that it is possible that what we had been seeing at the early elementary level was in fact a bubble. He was not predicting that, but as a bubble he meant it may have been an initial spike that would come down again, and we kind of followed that peak of students across the K-12 continuum. He was not recommending that that's what he thought would happen, but he at least made it known as a possibility. At that point in time, it was decided that we were not taking public action because it would necessitate, at the end of the day, a referendum, because we would have to physically add to our buildings to make this happen. What happened in the interim? Working with principals to ensure staffing models, we've had to convert space in multiple buildings that was not currently being used at the time as classroom space to classroom space. And the middle school, as part of the strategic work, switched from a junior high model to an inclusive middle school model, 7 and 8. Since that point, or through that point in time, we've had multiple public presentations, including the most recent Parent Academy, where we actually presented a number of the plans. Specifically, we had the architect and the demographer present for the presentations. It was extremely well attended, a number of commissioners as well, the Board of Education, etc., to get the information out publicly that we wanted to move. Since that time, we've had a great amount of conversation with two specific buildings, one being Yannicka School and one being Washington School. They are the two at this current instant, or actually a year ago, that were most pressed for space. In our delay of a year and a half, what information has added to our initial summary is that the demographer's report has been proven accurate. It turned out, at least for the last 2 years, it has not been a bubble, but those increased numbers at the early elementary have maintained or sustained themselves to the point where we're entering one section more in kindergartens than we had consistently in the past, where if it was 2, it's now 3, where if it was 3, it's now 4. And that has remained consistent. Again, those public presentations were made. We've had conversations with Washington School constituents as well as Yannicka. One of the things that was made clear to the LRFPC at the time is that if we were going to make a move of students, that we do so with respect to the students and the parents, ensuring them for lack of a better phrase, senior year, so that they knew going in that this would be in fact their last year at the building. We try to take it into account. This past year, working with Mrs. Carollo, because Yannicka School was the first school where space physically became an issue, we initially had a retreat, at which time I presented numbers. Those numbers at the time included collapsing a section of second grade at Yannicka School, and based on the existing numbers would have been around 24, which again is not ideal, but for the year, the idea was that we had time to figure out what we were doing and make moves on the space. At this point in time, Yannicka School is completely maxed out as far as space, to the point where we're using space that, again, were not initially classrooms, we converted to classrooms. Looking forward at that point in time, if we look at our kindergarten numbers, our numbers are actually low for the district at this point in time, again, thanks to Dr. Villani and Mr. Ferrara. But since our coming here in 2011, one of the things we have done is we've maintained a week-by-week progression of data on each individual elementary school and their trends, if you will, as far as enrollment from March all the way through September. At this point in time, our enrollment is low. We were impacted in kindergarten registration by a snow day. I'm not sure if that turned parents away. But two important pieces of note are that Washington is currently about consistent with where it normally is at this point in time, which means consistent over the past 3 years would mean another section. Yannicka School is a little bit lower than consistent currently, but again, still moving in the same general direction. And Spring Garden is about where it is normally, which means that that trend could also continue. So those are, again, the specifics as far as the student populations that we have now. Going back to the architecture report, not much has changed in the sense that the space that we had when the initial report came out is the space that we still have. As far as program, important things to note now, I don't think it's the time to set the board, but just a reminder, all the strategic work, all the curriculum changes that have happened, all the staffing changes to support that curriculum, the training and the rest, have all been built around the existing models. And then when it comes to budget, we have budgeted every year for unknown extra staff. It just becomes increasingly more difficult because our staff numbers go up if we've added these sections. And so between salary and benefits, Space is certainly an issue, but budget becomes increasingly tight.
One thing that you didn't mention, I think it's important that we do bring up, was at the same time we instituted the all-day kindergarten program.
Yes, and there are a number, I go back to that as well. Our student special education population has increased. Again, we have an autistic program, which is a financial savings to the district currently if you work out sending those students out. Also, just by definition of best practice, being inclusive of the students and keeping them in district, that is considered best practice. It's nice that best practice actually lines up with what's most affordable. At the same time, though, requirements have shrunken, if you will, how many people we can put in a specific building. At the same time, though, just before I got here, we moved to full-day kindergarten, which Dr. Ronnie talked about in her dissertation as she became doctor. But there seems to be a strong correlation between full-day kindergarten and high performance for students long-term. So again, best practice, absolutely the right move, but it certainly doubled the number of rooms that we need for kindergarten.
And we also went through re-registration process.
We have in fact gone through the re-registration process that is ending this week. Again, it's fewer than 20 students who will be removed. And again, a point that I've had to make, and just since we have the audience, I know the board is aware of this, but the idea that there are numbers from the state on per pupil spending. We cannot take the number of students that were disenrolled and multiply that by the $13,000 the state says we're spending per pupil and say that we've saved that money in the budget, because that money's already been spent on teachers and everything else. We did not find less than 20 students all in the same grade level in the same building, at which point we could reduce a teacher. Those 20 students are actually across all 7 buildings at multiple grade levels, so at the end of the day when they're removed, we have not been able to collapse anything and actually physically save any money in the budget. However, what we can say are 2 things. Doing our best to guarantee that Nutley schools are for Nutley students. They live here in order to attend here, otherwise we'll be paying tuition. And the other piece is that we'll put into place an electronic process which did not exist before, and that will be used randomly moving forward year to year to try and disincentivize people from cheating the system.
That re-registration number,
Yes.
20 to 30, that's
It's
20.
below 20.
It's below 20. Those are students that we found. What about students that didn't enroll again? They were here for 4th grade, but they didn't come back for 5th grade.
The last piece of that work, as once we disenroll, as we mentioned to the board, is that we will go back and study from September when we started disenrollment to the current point in time when we actually disenrolled, how many students transferred out of the district that were already on. So that we'll be able to make a full report on these are the students that, not the specific students, but this is the number of students that were disenrolled, as well as during that time, this many students transferred out into where geographically. Again, if they transferred to Maryland or Cape May, chances are they weren't living there and coming here for school. But if they transferred to Passaic, to Clifton, to Belleville, to Bloomfield, then it certainly, while not 100% confirmable, we can take into account the fact that may have dissuaded some people from cheating the system as it is.
So let's maybe we talk about also that just before, as we were through the long-range planning, just before the Roach thing was announced, we actually worked on constructions and costs, there's physical plans that we've also discussed as well when we briefed the commissioners. So there are things in place, ready to go. It's just that the Roach situation hit and the issue was backed up on moving those forward.
3 pieces on that. The first is just again to remind the board specifically, we have an audience as well. Mr. Scalera is 100% correct. We were 100% ready to go with plans. We had costed everything out. We had sized everything. We had used the land at that time that was available to us. We had looked at special education populations, cost, tax impact, and all the pieces that we gain at each of the 5 elementary buildings. The board making the decision at the time that it was far better to run one construction project for efficiency's sake and the rest, and alleviate these space issues at 5 different buildings at the same time, while building a stronger academic program, than it was to take on 5 individual and different physical construction projects and not change the academic program at all. The second piece is that because Roche happened when it did, our demographer filed an addendum to the report taking the information we received from the commissioners based on their planners, and was able to disregard their outcomes but look at their specific numbers and make projections based on what they said could happen, best case, worst case scenarios, or again, they're variable terms, but based on the least amount of impact of the district and the most amount coming from that space, so he was even more accurate because he had their planners report. And again, we had to double check with the architect that the 2 recommendations we were making would be able to hold that impact if we were going that direction, so that we weren't moving forward with a plan that wasn't taking into consideration